Hello class. In the last session we discussed about the DNS, that is domain name system, and there we have seen about the basic structure of the DNS, that is the hierarchical organization of the DNS. Then after the structure we have discussed about what is the working of the DNS, how does the DNS work, that we have seen. Now in this session we shall complete the remaining things about the DNS, and that is we will see basically that is mapping the names to the address, that is how the mapping is done, that part we shall see. So let us first of all see that how is the mapping of a domain name is done to the corresponding IP address, and after this we will see the reverse one. So in this mapping the names to the address, let the domain name be suppose xxx.yyyy.zzz.edu. Suppose this is the domain name which needs to be resolved to get the IP address. So what happens is that as per the procedure we have discussed that how the DNS works, we can see this query, an appropriate query is formed, and that query is sent to the local DNS server. Right, this means that a query containing this domain name goes to the local DNS server for resolution by the resolver. Right, so with the aim that this DNS server some way resolves the query for resolution by the resolver. There will be a resolver procedure we have seen, library procedure, which resolves this query and performs the required kind of mapping to get the corresponding IP address. So this is how briefly the mapping of a domain name is done to the corresponding IP address. Then the reverse mapping we can see now, that is how the mapping of an IP address is done to a domain name. Fine. So in certain situations this kind of mapping is also required. In such case we can see the inverse domain will be required, as we have discussed earlier. So this kind of mapping uses the inverse domain. Here we can see that this type of query is called a PTR query. This type of query is named as PTR query also. So, and this requires the inverse domain required. Now we can see that suppose the IP address is this one, 142.36.48.118 as an example, some arbitrary example. The resolver inverts this address and adds two labels as follows. Fine. So the resolver will invert this address first, means 118.48, right? So this way 118.48.36.142. This inverted IP address dot this label in address for inverse address dot ARPA as a standard label name we have seen in the case of the inverse domain, you can recall. So this kind of packet is formed, right? So this, when this has been formed in this way, this goes into this inverse domain, and this is received by the local DNS server, fine, which uses the inverse domain and resolves this to get the corresponding name or domain name. So this has basically given you an idea about that how the mapping part is done in the DNS. So now we can share briefly about, as we have discussed earlier, regarding the resolution, right? That is how this mapping is done, how the queries are resolved. So for that purpose we can see that how the resolution is done, query resolution. So as far as the resolution is concerned, there can be basically two types of the resolutions which are used. One is called the recursive resolution, and the other one we shall see is known as the iterative resolution. These two types of the resolutions are used, recursive and iterative. Let's see about both of these one by one. Whereas in most of the situations the recursive resolution is used. So let us first of all see about the recursive resolution, what it is. We can see in this that a client or say resolver requests for recursive or final answer from a name server. This means that a client who requests for the resolution, the resolver at the client end, right? The resolver procedure at the client end requests for the recursive or final answer from a name server. Fine. So to the name server, it gives the request with the aim that the final answer should be achieved. How does it happen? This let us see. If this server, means if this local server, DNS server, is authorized for the domain name, then it checks its database and sends a reply. Fine. So if this local server to which the query has come, if it is authorized, then it will check its database. From there it will do the mapping and send the reply, means will give the corresponding result. So this is one case. Next case or the point is that, but if this server is not authorized, right? if it is not authorized, means the solution is not available at this server itself, then it diverts this request to another server, which may be usually the parent server, not necessarily, but usually it may be the parent server, and waits for the response to come. Right? So this is how the recursive resolution goes. To understand it better, you can see that with the help of this diagram, right, that how this recursive resolution works. For example, say there is a client over here, right? Then there are the various DNS servers available. The local DNS server for this client is suppose the fh.edu server. Then we have the parent of this server as a edu server, and then there is another server, say csu.edu server, right? So in this example, suppose say some query is given at this client. This client gives the request for resolving the query, some domain name maybe. So that query, we have shown this step numbers or the sequence numbers. The first step is this, second step is this, third is this, fourth, fifth and sixth, right? So we can see this, the request from client goes to first its local DNS server, say this one, fh.edu server. There, suppose the resolution is not done, the solution is not available, or it is not authorized, say, then suppose if it was authorized, then immediately from this server itself to the client the response would have come. But in this case we are assuming that the resolution is not available, or say it is not authorized. Then in this case the query goes as per step number 2 to the next server, say edu server, which is in the case its parent server. There it is tried to resolve this, but then in this case suppose it is found that this is also not an authorized one. Then the appropriate path is seen here for resolving. From there this query is redirected to the this server, that is the csu.edu server. Fine. Now at this csu.edu server, suppose that it is the authorized one where the mapping is done, query is resolved, the request is resolved, and then from its database or its table the corresponding IP address is retrieved as a response. Then as a response, this response, or say the, for example, address, IP address, this follows this path, the reverse path, right? So the fourth step goes to this one, this edu server, and from there it comes to the fh.edu server, and from there it comes to the client from where the request was originated, so that now client gets the required IP address, right? So this has shown us a procedure by means of which the addresses are resolved. I mean, the mapping is done. The mapping can be both ways, name to the address or say address to the name, right? So we can see that such a query is called a recursive query. This is the way the recursive resolution is done. Fine. So this recursive mechanism we have seen, which is actually used practically in most of the situations, whereas now we can see the next kind of the resolution as well, that is the iterative resolution. The iterative resolution is, as its name is suggestive, the various iterations are performed to get the result finally, right? So what happens in this case is that any request for resolution from any client, any request for resolution, this is taken individually to all the possible name servers directly. So in this case, what happens is, for example, we can see in this diagram that, say, there is a client and there are various name servers available, DNS servers, say server 1, server 2, server 3, and so on. So in this case, what will happen is that any request for resolution will go individually to each of these servers, and from whichever server we get the final answer, the process stops there. So for example, a query goes from this client to this server 1 first. From there, if it is the authorized server, immediately the client will get the corresponding result or response. Otherwise, if this server 1 is not an authorized one, then the query will be taken separately to the next server, say server 2, and will try to get the result. If the response is available, fine. Otherwise, we'll look for the another server, right? So this is the way in which the iterative resolution takes place. Fine. So this discussion about this resolution in the DNS completes the topic of DNS, and therefore we close over here in this session, and in the next session we will be sharing about some other protocols or the application layer level protocols. Thank you.